Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 195, December 9th through December 15th, 1864. Last week, we talked about Chief Justices and also quotes on the holidays during the Civil War. This week, we are going to close the book on Hood's campaign into Tennessee. While at the same time Savannah is falling to Sherman and his army, Lincoln and Grant are going to get the doubly good news that Hood will be turned back as well. To get there, though, we will need to fight the Battle of Nashville. Before we fight the Battle of Nashville, we do need to talk a little bit about our Patreon content. And of course, we do have a new episode that has been posted. Here in the month of December, we decided to do the best monuments, or at least my top 10 monument list of different battlefields across, the different theaters. We covered a couple of the big ones, of course, Gettysburg, Antietam, Chickamauga, the big three there, and we actually had some monuments on a couple of other battles. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, I included the pictures on that Patreon post as well, so you get to see the monument, get to talk a little bit about where it is and its significance. If that sounds like something that would interest you, there is a link in the show description for the Patreon. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left things off in this theater, the Battle of Franklin had been fought. Considered to be the Pickett's charge of the West, it did see more troops into an attack than at Gettysburg, but with very similar results. At points the line bent, but it did not break for the Union troops, in some places being defended by rookie regiments. A drain would be seen on the Confederate General Officer Brain Trust. Cleburne was dead, arguably the best combat leader the Confederates had in this theater. Additionally, units who had served throughout the conflict were mere shells of their former self. Cockrell's Missouri regiments were decimated, Cleburne's command was in shambles, as was Brown's command, which had borne hard fighting in the previous battles. What do we make, though, of Franklin? Well, much like Pickett's charge, amazingly, the battle almost goes the way for the Confederates. Hood might have been able to cut off the Union troops from their crossing of the Harpeth River. Indeed, some Union officers wrote that in the center the Confederates would control that escape route, meaning that the army would be split in half and unable to escape. But why exactly did it fail? Well, there are a variety of reasons. For one, the Union defenders put up a strong fight. Even rookie regiments performed extremely well. Some of the units were armed with superior weapons. Artillery was a major advantage, and the ground the rebels had to assault was open, and they had no artillery support of their own. Remember that in the description that Jacob Cox actually gives us of the battlefield, it gives us a very nice picture of how the battle is just this open plain that the Confederates have to go across. There's not a whole lot of cover. Pickett's charge is considered to be a blunder, but it has since found some redemption. Is this because historians often look more highly on Lee in general, and Hood has such a bad reputation as an army commander? There is probably some bias, but I think in both cases with Hood and Lee, the tactics are sound. The only real difference with Franklin and Gettysburg in my mind is that Lee has less options than Hood. Hood certainly could have moved around the defenses. Forrest has a good idea, and that should have been considered. Only Thomas Wood's division would have been on the far side of the Harpeth, and so far in the campaign, the rebel cavalry had victimized James Wilson. In many ways, Franklin is an indictment of John Bell Hood's tenure as Army commander. It did not take a genius to come up with an all-out, straightforward attack. Much in the same ways as the battles around Atlanta, there are some opportunities, but there might have been more options on the table that could have saved some casualties. Impatience is really what it comes down to. I equate it to a baseball game in which you have a hitter who wants to come up with one big swing that's going to cut the deficit, trying to hit a home run when really all you need is a single to get something going for the team. We will see the fallout of these big cuts here as the Army continues to Nashville, but in many ways the campaign and all hopes for the Confederacy end on the fields at Franklin. We can go back to the comparison between Gettysburg and Franklin in that really by the third day at Gettysburg, Robert E. Lee doesn't really have any more choices. He needs to continue the fight right there at Gettysburg. He can't really disengage in front of the enemy. Longstreet has a pretty good idea on the second day of actually shifting the army around, but there's already been a whole lot of casualties. They already have the ground. The assaults on the second day actually almost work. That shouldn't be pointed out as well. So then the third day, we need to try what we haven't tried before, and that's to hit the center. And Pickett's charge does almost work. Whereas in Hood's case, he doesn't have that lack of options. He can just move around the army. We just spent an entire campaign in Atlanta of Sherman's army moving around the Confederates and constantly making them shift their lines, make new defensive lines. Hood could have used some of that strategy instead of punching straight forward for the Federal lines. Now, we can also point out, though, that Hood is going to see the fact that the Union troops are on one side of the river, there's some on the other side of the river, and he says, well, this is a really good opportunity to attack. So it's not without merit that he did a grand assault against the Union troops. We can kind of see it from his perspective, but just execution-wise, it's all over the place. Now, speaking of Franklin, as we mentioned 2 episodes ago, John Schofield would remove his army. There were many in the Union host that would consider this to be an unnecessary move. Extracting the army while in the face of the Confederates, who the Union forces had just dealt a tremendous blow, leaving so many wounded and dead on the field, seemed to not make a whole lot of sense to the rank and file. George Thomas, though, was not going to be on the best terms with Schofield and would want to get all his forces into the Nashville defenses. He would be able to amass some 55,000 men in the defense of the city, meaning he had quite a bit more than Hood, especially after Franklin. A.J. Whiskey Smith had arrived with combat veterans. Thomas, who, while competent, was fairly cautious, would wait for Hood to attack. Now, Washington is not going to want this to be the plan. To them, this was going to sound a lot like some of their previous commanders that they had become dissatisfied with, notably William S. Rosecrans, the former superior to Thomas. Thomas being seen more as a Rosecrans partisan than someone trusted by Grant and his officer cadre. Rather, the administration wanted to see an attack. But really, if you think about it, Thomas might not have been wrong to want to wait. Hood had not only attacked around Atlanta, but most notably, he had very nearly wrecked his army south of Nashville. Who was to say that he would not try to do it again? I might also like to mention that this was not going to be fair criticism of Rosecrans, who did have plans, albeit he often took a good while to get going. No, Thomas had seen the Confederates in this theater, even beyond Hood, back to the Bragg days, and they always attacked. Remember the Rock of Chickamauga? It was his stand on Snodgrass Hill that had made the only real Confederate victory in the sub-theater very costly. The troops would improve upon the defenses of the city, several forts dotting the perimeter, making for an imposing sight for the oncoming Confederates. By December 2nd, the rebels were within sight of Nashville, and while the Tennessee troops were hardened by being so close to the city lost since 1862, they would see the defenses in despair. Despair was not on the mind of the Confederate Army commander, though. The positive in his mind was that if he raided into the countryside, then Thomas might have to reinforce areas, and maybe he could defeat them in detail. He would send out Forrest and his cavalry. Several blockhouses had been constructed to protect against raids, and also guerrillas, so several of these would be hit and rail traffic disrupted. A regiment would be dispatched to disrupt river traffic as well. The raiding of the countryside was something that Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck were all afraid of. Grant would advise that maybe Schofield should replace Thomas. Schofield again was bumping heads with Thomas, thinking that the Virginian was hanging him out to dry in the campaign leading up to Nashville. Remember, too, that List was not a fan of old Pap, Thomas potentially replacing him back in the Halleck days. But they would make Grant be the only one to actually fire Thomas, and to his credit, he would delay. In the meantime, Forrest's cavalry would raid all the way to Murfreesboro. Rosecrans had built a major earthwork there known as Fortress Rosecrans, which is still impressive to see today. Commanding there was Lovell Rousseau. It's been a while since we have talked about Rousseau, and I fear we have overlooked his July cavalry raid, which we will go back and cover in an upcoming episode. But he would also have with him Robert Milroy. Remember, it's been a while since we talked about Milroy, him being the commander at the Second Battle of Winchester, which is a prelude to the Confederate invasion into Pennsylvania. Forrest would also have William Bates' brigades of infantry, and would try to set a trap for the Federals. Milroy would march out of the fortress and engage with Forrest's men in a kind of reconnaissance. Initially, he would believe that only Confederate horsemen were arrayed against him, and so he would use cavalry of his own to charge, which would prove costly in terms of casualties. Forrest, for his part, was determined to fall on the rear of the enemy with his troopers. Milroy again was leading his troops into the field, skirmishing with the rebels, but he would not realize that Red Jackson was set to cut him off from Fortress Rosecrans, which was the point of the operation for the Confederates. His troops would pull back, but then maneuver in a way in which they had flanked the southern line. They would smash into the Confederates, Forrest attempting to get the Floridians under bait to stand, shooting a color bearer who was breaking for the rear. He only needed enough time for Red Jackson to get into position, but alas, the troops would not hold, even with a desperate shifting of infantry to seal off the line. William Bate was hated by many of his troops, including the Sunshine Staters, and thus a battle fought relatively on the Old Stones River battlefield, called Overall Creek, would end with 300 casualties on both sides. Lovell Rousseau would soon write that he could forage into the countryside with impunity. We see kind of a prelude to the actual Battle of Nashville proper, in that these Confederate troops are becoming less and less willing to stand against Federals. And we should say, even if they are in a defensive position, right? Like, if you have dug in, especially in the main theater of the war, the Eastern Theater, right? Then the Confederates are going to try to hold their ground at all costs. There's going to be a lot of morale boost into fighting behind earthworks. We see that here in this theater, and it doesn't go the way of the Confederates, right? So there's definitely a problem with your morale if that is happening. With Forrest and Bate returning to the siege around Nashville, the morale of the rest of the army was going to be dampering, not just because of the wintry conditions, though. Many of the Confederates were without winter clothing and low on supply due to poor logistics. As a result, many of the pickets would freeze to death. Meanwhile, the morale was higher in the Federal ranks. Despite the cold, they were also better fed and equipped. Thomas was adding in strength, although Grant, Halleck, and Stanton were again becoming irritated with him. There had been some promises of attacking the rebels, but Thomas was in a peculiar spot. He had a lot of untried garrison troops, but also had combat veterans in Schofield's command and the 4th Corps, now commanded by Thomas Wood due to Stanley's wounding at Franklin. Additionally, A.J. Smith's command was on hand. But the weather had turned so suddenly that offensive action was not going to be advisable. In addition, Thomas was waiting for Wilson to mount up his cavalry to meet Forrest, whose numbers were a little inflamed. Thomas would hold a council of war, which would conclude with Wilson, Steedman, Smith, and Wood all deciding on holding until the weather turned for the better. Schofield would reluctantly agree in the meantime, and George Thomas would be informed that he might be feeding false information back to Washington. If Grant, Stanton, and Halleck would be appeased, then Thomas had to like his chances. Smith would have divisions under John MacArthur, Kenneth Garrard, and John Moore. MacArthur and Garrard we have spoken of before, while Moore was a politician from Indiana. William McMillan had been a surgeon during the Crimean War and served at Richmond, Kentucky, would command a brigade for MacArthur, with Lucius Hubbard and Sylvester Hill. Hubbard was a politician who would become the 9th governor of Minnesota, while Hill had participated in the Gold Rush before raising an Iowa regiment in the beginning of the war. David Moore, James Isham Gilbert, and Edward Wolfe would command brigades under Garrard. Washington Elliott had taken division command from George J. Wagner in the 4th Corps, and Beatty likewise had taken over in a division role. Elliott, remember, had commanded cavalry during the Atlanta campaign, although the Federal mounted arm had not really dazzled during those engagements, so Elliott seemingly was benched and sent back to the infantry. Wagner might have been drunk at Franklin, but also needed to go home and care for his wife, which might have been a convenient excuse for him. Franklin, though, was overshadowed even in contemporary sources, especially with the campaign about to come to a close. Otherwise, the 4th Corps is relatively the same as it was during that battle. Thomas Ruger's division of the 18th Corps would be commanded by Darius Couch. Now, we have not seen Couch for a long time, probably since he was gathering militia units to try to respond to Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania back in 1863. Remember, at that point, he was number 2 to Hooker and on the short list for overall command of the Army of the Potomac. He had previously been proven, at least as a capable officer. Couch would have brigades under Joseph Cooper, Orlando Moore, and John Maringer. Cooper has been in our story since Mill Spring, commanding East Tennessee troops being born in Kentucky. He will go back into politics after the war and be involved in the creation of a state guard in the violence of Reconstruction after the conflict. Schofield would pair him with Jacob Cox, who had been solid for most of the war, and probably turned in one of his best performances at Franklin. Cox has brigades under Charles Doolittle, John Casement, and Israel Stiles. Doolittle has been in our story before, being wounded at Gaines's Mill during the 7 days. Casement and his brigade bore the brunt of the assaults on the Confederate right during Franklin. He was a railroad man before the war and would be after, working on the Transcontinental Railroad. If you have seen the AMC series Hell on Wheels, the main character, Cullen Bohannon, is actually based partly on Casement. There would be a large provisional detachment made up of a hodgepodge of commands. James Steedman would be the commanding officer of these troops. Charles Cruft would command a division, with Benjamin Harrison a brigade. This also would include a brigade of United States colored troops under Thomas Morgan. Morgan had seen action at Decatur early in the campaign. He would become a Baptist minister after the conflict. The Confederate defense was set up with Stuart's command on the left, Lee in the center, and Cheatham on the right. While some of Forrest's cavalry had been dispatched to continue to disrupt river traffic and railroad supply, Chalmers was still protecting the left. Hood, for his part, was concerned about the left, A.P. Stuart building several strong earthworks there to protect from any attack. Thomas would finally be goaded into assault. You have to feel for him a bit. I won't lie that I am a George Thomas fan, but Blackjack Logan is apparently in the position to move to Louisville and perhaps take over for him. Schofield would, in the meantime, possibly be tapped to take over operations on the ground. Now, this also highlights just how the Battle of Franklin is overshadowed. Having just dealt a blow to Hood and his army is unable to lead a true proper siege. And for Thomas, it would seem like he had time to actually develop his troops before attacking. Hood might even try for a wild effort to take the city, who knows? For Thomas, roughly half of his troops were deemed unfit for offensive action. He would have to rely heavily on rookie units as it was. But Thomas would decide to rumble out of the defenses, marking December 15th as the day for the attack. This would be good for Thomas because at the time, Grant would be flip-flopping on whether to actually sack him. He would leave the decision up to the administration, but ultimately give the word. A Major Eckhart was tasked with wiring the decision, but wisely would hold off, instead waiting to hear from Thomas. Thomas would not be removed, as we shall soon see. Now, whether Schofield was actually feeding bad information back to Washington is a subject for debate. Actually, he denies this, continues to deny it even after the war, but we do know that he was not so kind to Thomas in his personal writings, so it is hard to say whether he was actually kind of bad-mouthing him behind his back. The plan would be for Steedman and his provisional command to hold down the rebel right, while Smith and Wood would flank on the rebel left. Wilson, meanwhile, would check Chalmers. Ready or not, and with the clock sort of ticking for Thomas, the stage was set. The action would begin with gunboats firing on Chalmers and his cavalry. Richard Johnson would have his command ride out and engage, although they would be pushed back by Chalmers and his veterans. One Union regiment was only armed with pistols and sabers, so they would be repulsed by good positions held by the Confederate cavalry. Remember, too, that Forrest's command, his cavalry, acts more like mounted infantry. They actually have stronger defensive positions. They have weapons that would be conducive to that kind of defense as well. Johnson, it should be said, sort of holds off, continuing to press after Chalmers, the cavalry engagement on the western part of the field, ending in a stalemate. Meanwhile, on the Union left, Steedman's command would attempt to flank the Confederate lines. Originally, this was supposed to be a feint, but Hood was concerned that this was going to be where the main Union attack would fall. It was seen that this particular area was going to need to be secured by the Union troops in order to sort of venture out and save Murfreesboro. I say save in air quotes because obviously Lovell Rousseau was not needing any saving, at least not in the physical sense. The Union attack would be conducted by Thomas Morgan and his United States colored troops, along with some other thrown-together commands. Without properly scouting out the ground, the Union troops would try to get into the rebel rear. What they did not know is that the flank was protected by a lunette named Granbury's Lunette, manned by the remnants of his Texas Brigade, currently under control of a captain. While concealed by trees and brush, the rebels would pour a deadly fire into the United States colored troops, inflicting heavy casualties and throwing many back into confusion. Additionally, the rebels were interested in evening the score after Franklin. Some would write of the great slaughter that was unleashed on the Union troops in this area, the flanking attack ending before it really got off the ground. Sidney Post's command would attack near the center, but they would also be repulsed, Post being wounded in the process as part of the action. On the Confederate left, though, there would be a mass attack by Wood and Smith's command. Several redoubts would be placed out in front and along the Confederate lines, numbering 1 through 5. Part of Wilson's cavalry had been in the way, but they too would be holding the flank of the assault. Schofield would be angry at not having a place in the plan, but his 18th Corps would be thrown into the far flank, overlapping the Confederate line. Smith was eager to get underway, but the cavalry would advance, dismounted, racing the infantry, so to speak, to get at the redoubts. The 9th Illinois Cavalry of Hatch's command would capture 2 of these positions, amazingly combined with infantry support. Herbal artillery had been sighted too high, and the Federals had the advantage of numbers. Some of the cavalrymen would reportedly force the Southern artillery to turn on their own men, but this would be limited and mostly just manned by the horsemen themselves. When the 4th redoubt fell, the 5th would turn their fire on the captured work, forcing the Federals to assault that area. The Confederate infantry in the meantime would collapse. Chalmers had placed his baggage behind some infantry that would break and run, the enemy horsemen capturing it to his embarrassment and anger at the lack of backbone of the non-mounted troops. The 4th Corps would launch a general assault on the remaining flank. Franklin had sapped whatever will there was to continue, however. Many of the rebels either surrendered in droves or simply ran. A.P. Stewart would grow disgusted by the manner in which his command would give up. Randall Gibson's Louisiana Brigade would be forced to refuse their line to make sure that the entire Confederate position was not rolled up by, amongst other units, Opdyke's brigade. In the meantime, Sylvester Hill's command would demand to attack, crying out, "Give us a fort," to Whiskey Smith, who would reply, "I'll give you one," ordering an attack on Redoubt 3. Hill would be struck with a bullet and killed during the assault, but his men would carry the work. Hood desperately would call on some reserves to hold up a new position, luckily nightfall saving the Army of Tennessee from complete rout, a la say, a Fisher's Hill. They had lost some 1,500 men to surrender, many artillery pieces, and several hundred casualties. Now Hood has a decision to make. He could withdraw. In fact, finding a position to the south better suited for defense might have been wiser. But he would keep his army 2 miles south of his original line, digging in to meet the enemy on the 16th. That would also lead us to the question of why Hood was at Nashville in the first place. Certainly, following Franklin, he would have no realistic hope of capturing the city. Hood was very confident, should Thomas be forced to attack, in a kind of careful what you wish for moment. Retreat would not be seen as a realistic option. The Confederates had come too far, and despite not being able to truly siege the city, they were at least putting pressure on the Union. Thomas believed that Hood might retreat following the successful action on the 15th. He would give Thomas Wood the discretion to attack if an opportunity opened for him. The two sides had probed toward each other. The Confederates had a new line with one end anchored on Peach Orchard Hill, this being the right, and the other end, the left, on Compton's Hill. A stone wall would be used in the center of the line. Hood would advise that the hills behind his position, the Brentwood Hills, should be used in case they needed to retreat. The 16th would see the Union Army begin with cavalry operations, Wilson pressing on Chalmers again despite there being rough terrain. Chalmers needed help, and so 2 brigades were dispatched to aid in this sector. Meanwhile, on the river right, the attacks were renewed again. Sidney Post and Abel Strait would lead their brigades against Peach Orchard Hill. These would be supported by the United States colored troops under Thompson. Following a bombardment, Post would lead his men against the rebel works, although they would be stopped short, Post being wounded in the process. The United States colored troops would throw themselves aggressively against the Confederates, just as they had done on the 15th, suffering heavy casualties in the process. The 13th United States colored troops would lose some 40% of their strength during these attacks. One Confederate would remark on their bravery, stating afterward that they came only to die. Cavalry on the one flank, and these attacks on the right would pull troops away from Compton's Hill, however. John MacArthur's division of Smith's Corps would advance on the hill. Hubbard's brigade, which included the 5th and 9th Minnesota, as well as the veterans in the 8th Wisconsin, would launch themselves at the Confederate works. Cavalry, meanwhile, would be working their way into the rear of the southern line, Govan's brigade collapsing following the wounding of that commander. Lieutenant Colonel William Shy would be shot in the head as he joined his men on the firing line during this engagement, the hill now known as Shy's Hill. The Florida Brigade of Bates' command would have enough given the tremendous pressure of the Union forces. Schofield had originally held back, but Thomas had pointed out to him that Smith was attacking regardless, and so the 18th Corps would also join in. Floridians would break, causing there to be a rout in this sector of the field. Several cannon commanded by René Beauregard, son of Pierre, would be captured. Thomas Benton Smith would be beaten by William McMillan following his surrender, causing that officer to be institutionalized after the war. Indeed, there were some instances of Confederates being shot as they tried to surrender or bayoneted. Shy's body was stripped and impaled on a tree. Hood, who had thought of a counterattack following the successful defense of Peach Orchard Hill, but with the left again collapsing for the second day in a row, would now try to focus the emphasis on saving the army. Should be noted that George Thomas actually just unrolls the same battle plan that he had done the previous day, right? This is the same exact thing. It sounds very repetitive, and actually when you're writing this episode, it is kind of hard because you're like, wait, is this the first day or the second day? Because essentially the same things happen, and Hood realizes too late it's kind of the same battle plan. He had developed these defenses. He had made the left stronger on the second day, but the area in which the defenses were placed was just not as good of a defensive work. The construction was poor. They were not on the military crest of the hill, and so it allows for this assault on the left to occur the same way that it does on the first day. Allegheny Johnson would be captured a second time during the war in this rout. S.D. Lee would try to rally his troops, eventually getting Gibson's Louisiana outfit to hold off the attacking Federals. Indeed, Chalmers and his cavalry also did good work in checking Wilson and his troopers. Had they not done so, it is likely that there could have been a complete cutting off of Hood's army. As it was, the Battle of Nashville was over. 6,000 Confederates were casualties, 4,500 being prisoners, compared to 3,000 Federals. This was one of the more lopsided victories of the war for the Union, and in terms of time elapsed, might have been one of the quickest as well. But it was not necessarily over for the Confederates. You see, Thomas had waited for Wilson to mount his cavalry, one of the reasons for delaying his offensive, getting him the criticism from Grant that almost led to his removal. Now mounted, he would have quite the force to try to chase down the rebels as they retreated. You often have heard me mention how, unlike Napoleonic warfare, armies do not get annihilated in the Civil War. Well, this would be maybe the closest to an army would come to being destroyed a la Napoleon. Wilson would press on the Southerners. All that remained to block them would be some units of S.T. Lee's command, being still relatively fresh, and Forrest cavalry. They would make a stand before crossing the Harpeth River, giving Wilson a bloody nose that probably gave him some 400 casualties. Franklin, though, would be recaptured, as would some 1,500 additional Confederate wounded who were recuperating there. Lee would be wounded during this action. Hood was convinced that he would need to continue the retreat rather than to make a stand at the Duck River, but there would be some more skirmishing between Forrest cavalry, Cheatham's infantry, and Walthal's with the pursuing Federals. Cavalry would grow tired, and the infantry was exhausted. Forrest would still pack a punch, bludgeoning Wilson 2 more times, although reportedly he also pulled a pistol on Frank Cheatham because, Forrest. Texans would be sent ahead to hopefully guard against the looting of Tuscumbia. However, they would in fact do some looting themselves. But the army by January would make it to safety. John Bell Hood would be removed from his post at the head of the Army of Tennessee. Richard Taylor would take over, but the troops would soon be dispersed. Some would be sent toward the Carolinas to try to defend against Sherman, while others were sent to Mobile. The Second Great Army of the South was no more. We must really take a look at Hood's tenure as leading the entire command. Much like Bragg, he gave in to internal squabbles, probably costing the Confederacy its greatest combat leader in the theater. His planning was uninspired, and sometimes would change frequently. Why did he attack at Franklin? Why did he stay at Nashville? We can even go back to Atlanta and ask why he launched several unsuccessful assaults. We might redeem him slightly by saying the concept of the Atlanta attacks was at least sound, and Spring Hill might have been one of his best moves as a general. The other being helping to keep his army from being completely wiped out following his mistakes. We might have said similar things about Bragg when evaluating him early in the year. But that led us to an interesting point. I would argue that Hood and Bragg are more similar than they are different, and certainly both are very different than Johnson. But why is Bragg the bad guy where Hood sort of gets a pass? Could it be because Hood is actually a pretty decent brigade commander and then division commander in the Army of Northern Virginia first? Is it because Bragg threw people under the bus harder? It is an interesting question, and one maybe we should ponder. I think that Bragg is hated more because the army was still in question when he was commanding, whereas with Hood, it's sort of already over. But again, I would invite you to make your own opinion. So we will end the episode with the end of Hood's invasion into Tennessee. Much like the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Tennessee is no longer the same and will cease to exist. Hood we must say goodbye to, although there would be more battles to come in 1865. Next week, we will talk about a few scattered events. We need to talk about Egypt, Missouri, and also Stoneman's raid into southwest Virginia. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.